There we go. Okay.
Okay, my dad was born in Dayton, Ohio. He grew up in a village north of Dayton called Vandalia. It's where the Dayton Airport is today. He was an only child, and unfortunately, he lost his father when he was 15 years old. I think it was in 41. And that created a kind of a major crisis. I think, and I think you'll probably agree at the end of my talk here, he went through about 4 or 5 pretty strenuous years. From losing his father, having to commute to high school, they moved from one county to another. They had to, okay, good, thank you. He had to ride his bike 3 miles to school, sort of the old, had to go uphill both directions, right? He hitchhiked quite a bit, and he ended up graduating from the Vandalia High School in 1942, but he started working on a neighborhood farm because his mother, Vandalia was the home of the Grand National Trap Shoot you may have heard of, or over the years it's since moved. But the only job she had was she'd do in the food service. During the 2-week period that the trap shoot was on, she had employment there. So she had no skills other than cooking, kitchen type things. And if it wasn't for her sister who lived on a farm, and she had a couple other brothers, her immediate family, they would have had a really tough time. But they survived. He worked on this farm supporting his mother, and I think that's kept him out of the 1943 draft. He was drafted in June of 44, mainly because I think they tightened up the draft requirements. They needed men after an extended period in Europe and the Pacific too, of course. So he was drafted in 44, went to Kentucky, and then went down to Texas, was in a couple different bases down there in basic training, and was trained on a 105 millimeter artillery piece, and then later got transferred to infantry because they didn't need any more artillerymen, they needed infantry, frontline grunts. And so he went to Europe in January, late January, and got in the European theater, went through the cigarette camps, and joined at Schmidt, which is near Aachen into Germany, and there's some areas called the Ruhr Dams, and that's where the 9th Infantry had been hanging out and protecting those dams during the Battle of the Bulge. So he kind of was a replacement coming into the Battle of the Bulge, although the 9th wasn't actively involved like some of the other units. He joined at Schmidt and was part of the 47th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 9th. And Schmidt had been an area of several battles, and one of the books that I have here with one of his guys he came over with wrote, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, but he writes in there that there were several dead soldiers still laying around in trenches. It was winter, and so he was thrown right into the battle environment, although I don't think they were shelled at that point in time. And then so he participated in the final push into Germany. So I got interested in, before 95, but we took my parents to Germany. I finally talked him in. I said, let's do a trip. I want to see where you were. So he agreed. And my mother, my wife, and I took him to Europe. We had a fantastic trip. But the 2 places he wanted to go was the Remagen Bridgehead and Oberkirchen, which I'd never heard of before. And I'm going to talk about that. We went to both those areas. We ended up actually after we were at these battlefields, we went through the Bavarian forest, met some people at a guest house. We didn't know what the word whipped cream was, and this little lady toddles over and says it's Schlag. And we met her, and we became friends. They came over here, we went there. We know their whole neighborhood. And so for the last, since 95, we've had this experience with the Germans, which has been fantastic. We talked to her, the one lady, we talked to her 2 or 3 times a month. So a lot of this information I was able to gather, particularly the German information, she helped me translate. So it was a fortuitous meeting. My dad got lung cancer in 2006. He never smoked after 63. He smoked during the war, stopped cold turkey in 63 when the Surgeon General came out with that warning, and ended up with lung cancer in 2005. And my son and I went back in January 2006, and he was an only child, like I said, and so he had his mother's trunk up in the attic in the garage. And it was colder than hell up there, but I went up and went through it in January and found all these letters. And I found 98 letters that he had written to his mother. And I'm going, wow, these are great. Can I have these? And he goes, he was a little embarrassed. He goes, well, I don't know what I wrote. And so I'm going to tell you, he wrote a lot. And I got his artillery scores. I got his M1 scores as he was going through training. There's all that stuff in there. It's just amazing. So that started me on this quest. And of course, he had died in March, and ironically, he was wounded in March. And we were back for their 59th, what was it, 50?
I don't remember.
I don't remember. It was 59th anniversary, I believe. And we were there the week before, and he was getting worse and worse and worse. And hospice had come in and whatever, and you know, the whole story. And my mother called me back the next week, and he was had gotten really bad. And Friday, I got there on Saturday, but Friday was the last day he read the newspaper, and the last day he had drank coffee in the morning, like his normal routine. And then he was pretty much bedridden. And I was there Saturday and Sunday with him. My brother, who lives nearby, and his wife were helping my mother care for him at the home. He didn't want to die at the hospital. And so Monday morning rolls around. This is March 13th. And he's laying there, and I'm sitting there with him, and my sister-in-law is there. And I'm thinking, after going through some of this stuff, today's the 13th of March. That's the day he was wounded. I couldn't believe it. And I said something to my sister-in-law. Today's the anniversary of his wounding in 1945. And she goes, what? And she was kind of oblivious to it, and I repeated it. And, you know, an hour and a half later, he was gone. He had been trying, and they told me when I came in on Saturday that Friday he kept asking what day it was. Saturday he was asking what day it was. And their anniversary was on March the 4th, and he was wounded on March 13th, and he died on March 13th. And I thought that's kind of significant. I think he was waiting. It was a release. When I told him today's the day that he was wounded, that was a release, and he let go. So I find that kind of an interesting story. As I get further down the line, I started reading these newsletters. The 9th Infantry puts out, it's called the Octafoil. It's the patch. It's on this man's hat right here. And I started reading these newsletters that he was getting. He was always a member of the 9th Infantry Division Association, but never went to a meeting. I got his original card that he received in '45 when they organized, the men and the officers organized this group. They were in Ingolstadt and had just moved, and the war was just over, and these guys had the foresight to start this alumni group, basically. That still continues today. We'll talk about that in a little while. But in the newsletters, I discovered this book called A Private's Diary. There was a review written in the newsletter, and I'm reading through it, and I'm going, oh my gosh, that's E Company, 47th Infantry Division. This guy, and I found out later, they came over in the boat together in January. So he had written his experience. He was in the second platoon, and my dad was in the 3rd platoon. So they didn't fight necessarily together, but they were in very close proximity. And he had put all his experiences. Unfortunately, he was wounded in Getch on the handout. Geisch. There's a picture of it. That's where Jack was wounded. And so he missed the Remagen bridgehead, joined after he was in the hospital. I went, after finding this book and locating and finding this man still alive, I got to meet this guy. And so I joined the 9th Infantry Division Association, flew down to Orlando. He was there, lovely man, and he told me a whole bunch of stuff. Didn't know my dad directly. He remembered they slept near each other because the names were alphabetical. Bland and Barnhart were close, and he remembered those kinds of things. But boy, he was really a nice guy. And you know, in February, the next year, he died. So I had the luck of meeting Jack and becoming friends with his daughters now, who are still in the 9th Infantry Division Association. But that was a key to launching more research. It made it a lot easier to know where they were and what they were doing. And then, of course, I launched into all the records. I spent years, I don't know how much money, on records. The personnel records, the military history records, and then we traveled to Europe tracing his footsteps. I've been to Europe about 14 times, but we, together with this, we've been there 9 or 10 times relative to the World War II, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. So the 9th Infantry was organized in World War I. It wasn't committed. It was kind of held in reserve. Then they retired it and reorganized it again in 1940. They trained at Fort Bragg. An interesting sidelight, Fort Bragg now is the biggest military base in the country. The Airborne Corps, the 82nd, is there. And that 82nd was actually started by some contingents from the 9th Infantry. Before it was an infantry regiment, it was a division, 9th Division, and they took some of those men and officers, created the 82nd, and the 9th obviously got more trainees coming in, and continued on, did all their training in Fort Bragg and North Carolina, that area. They left in November of '42, and the 9th Infantry was in the entire war. They invaded Africa, later on invaded Sicily, and then were retrained in Britain. And then for D-Day, they were not part of the original troops, but they came in on D4 and D5, I believe, And then they turned and went up the Khartoum Peninsula and captured that. It took them about a month. And that was a deep water port that was important to the effort. Then they fought through France, Belgium, Germany, and they met the Russians on the Elbe River at the end of the war. They had, from what I can tell, the second amount of highest casualties next to the 3rd Infantry Division. I've seen some different numbers on that, so it's a little hard to tell exactly. But they were definitely up there. 23,000 casualties is a lot of men. There were definitely 4,581 killed in action. That's a number that's dear to our association, as we have a couple monuments, one at Fort Bragg, one in Worcester, Massachusetts at Holy Trinity, right?
Well, it's a Catholic church.
It's a Catholic church. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, we have a major memorial there. The unit had 24 presidential unit citations. And I might add, as I get into this, my dad participated in 2 of those. The octafoil, again, the insignia of the 9th, it symbolizes the one brother who's surrounded by his 8 brothers as support. So that graphically is what the octafoil represents. You remember that, right? I got a faithful 9th member right here, and the son of another 9th member here also. Basically, this is the path that my dad entered the war with. This is out of the history book, the 8 Stars to Victory, which is the history of the 9th Infantry Division. He joined here after the Hurtgen Forest was up in here, and Durin, Aachen is up in here somewhere. He joined down here at Schmidt, and they were just getting ready to cross the Rohr River. So they crossed the Rohr River, came in, we'll talk about that in a second, participated in the Rohr Pocket, then went to the Hertz Mountains. And Nordhausen is an area that was a V-2 rocket factory, a concentration camp, and elements of the 9th captured that. I have a friend in Texas. He's going to be 103 in October. He was there, and at the Nordhausen. And then they went on to, that's fine. Went on to Winterberg and the Elbe River and met the Russians.
Friend was at Nordhausen as a soldier or as a prisoner?
No, my friend was he's got an interesting story. I can tell you real quick. He's German. Left Germany in 1936 after he snuck into the Olympics, he tells me. His dad sent him to Cincinnati to get him out of there. They were Jewish. His last name is Stern. And he ended up in Cincinnati with an uncle or a cousin or something like that. Went to the University of Cincinnati. He came here, he was like 16 and didn't speak English. Ended up getting through school, and then University of Cincinnati, and then he was drafted. Ended up in the 9th Infantry in the medical detachment. And they found out he spoke German, French, and whatever else.
Very valuable guy.
And he became very valuable in the interrogations. One story he tells me that they had captured a German. This is the end of the war. I'm digressing here, but it's an interesting story. And this Nazi was not going to be interviewed by anybody of a lesser rank. And of course, he was just an enlisted man. He wasn't an officer. And so the commanding general, I don't know who that was, put his coat on him, said, "Go get him." And he chirped like a Anyway, they crossed the War River they were headed toward Bonn and Cologne area, and they crossed the Roer River on the 28th on I believe, a pontoon bridge. They soldiered through several small villages, and they were held in reserve. This is my dad's unit, E Company, was held at Frauenburg. He wrote a letter back to his mother and was on gray stationery and typed. So him saying he was quartered in houses is correct. They were held in German houses, and he was able to send her a letter on stationery from the house. Then on the 7th, as they were laying around waiting to do something, I guess, they were ordered to trucks, and they loaded between 8:30 and 10 o'clock at night, and they were trucked all night. It was rainy, dark, down to the Remagen bridgehead that had just been captured by the 9th Armored Division. And they got there about 4 o'clock in the morning, and then they began crossing soon after. This is a picture of Remagen. Remagen's a German village that was settled by the Romans. There's some Roman ruins here. The bridge was built just after, at the end of World War I, for Germany to ship material to the front in World War I. I don't know if it was ever used that way, but after the war, I know there were elements of the U.S. Troops that were on the bridge and at the bridge. I'm not quite sure what unit that was, but it was done then, and it was built in these areas here, the abutments, and probably on the other end, the abutment at both ends, chambers where they could put explosives so they could blow the bridge up. It was built as a defensive bridge. Another picture of Remagen, and you can see this one shows the abutment here and the abutment here, and that's the only thing that's standing today are these two abutments. And there's a museum in this one which was quite nice, but because of some political turmoil in the city of Remagen and somebody else, the museum's closed today. It's unfortunate because it's really a nice museum. So this was a significant event in World War II. This was basically after its capture and them trying to hold the bridgehead. This was the front in World War II at this point in time. There were other fronts happening, but all of a sudden, this bridge opened up all kinds of opportunities, and there was a study done by the, I don't want to go there yet, study done by the armored school later on after the war, and there's no date on this. I was able to find an original copy, and I've got it up here if you want to look at it, it's right here, that they went through after the fact and studied this and came to the conclusion that despite the organization of the military from the top down, right, this capture of the bridge was kind of from the bottom up. And the men were able to take initiative, seeing the bridge that was still left standing, even though we tried to bomb it, and then later the Germans tried to bomb it. The initiative was such that everything came together and they were able to capture it and hold it and use it for 10 days. And it allowed the troops, U.S. troops, into the mainland of Germany that really hadn't been invaded since Napoleon, I believe.
Those guys didn't want to get their boots wet.
No, they didn't. And once they were able to have that happen, there is a unit the 310 or the 78th crossed in the middle of the night, and then my dad's unit, the 47th, started crossing at 8:30, or pardon me, at 5:30 in the morning, and I believe he was in E Company, and I believe he was up front with all this, from what I can tell. There was numerous aerial defenses and support elements that descended on Remagen. I'll have some pictures of that. And I was telling John here the other day when I was here, he didn't know this, but this was the only place in Germany where the V-2 rocket was used on themselves. And I found a reference last night in this battle, after the battle, they fired 11 V-2s. I didn't know that, and they weren't real accurate. Some of them went to Cologne, which is 50 kilometers away probably, and another one got reasonably close to the bridge. Didn't hit it though. But that's kind of an interesting fact. There was also a Karl howitzer that shot 2-ton shells. They fired this at the bridge too. To try to take it out, they were trying everything they could to get rid of this bridge and stop the influx coming in. So this is a good picture of the bridge, and there's the turret I was talking about, the machine gun emplacements in some of these areas. There was barges out in here that they had machine guns, and if you've seen the movie, it's kind of fictitious, but it does show some of that. Or Bridge at Remagen, they made a movie about this several years ago. These are some pictures of troops arriving. Of course, this is after my dad crossed it. I don't know what date this is, but it's got to be early on as they were trying to get troops across. They brought in anti-aircraft. There were hundreds of planes, 168 or something I think I read, of which over 100 were shot down, trying to bomb and remove this bridge. They even used the submarine corps and some of those guys and sent swimmers down to try to set charges to blow the bridge up. So the Germans were trying to do everything in their power to get rid of this thing. So in the meantime, as they crossed the bridge here at Erpel, the 47th took the direct route, the 39th Combat Team, which is part of the 9th Infantry, and the 60th were on the sides going up. Unfortunately, my dad was in the center, and that was some of the worst fighting from what I can tell. There's the book that Ken Heckler wrote. It's a classic, and that's the basis of the movie. And he just recently died in the last 4 or 5 years. So E Company, I believe, was one of the first part of the 2nd Battalion of the 47th that crossed. Colonel Louis Manus was the battalion commander. He was a go-getter, and actually I talked to him several years ago before he died. He lived well into his 90s. My dad remembers crossing the bridge. There was open places in the deck, fast-moving water. They were shelling. It was not pleasant to get across. It was kind of this hurry up and wait, trying to get across. But he does remember seeing the aerial attack as they got above the bridge seeing the planes dropping in, and he also saw the first jet. He remembers seeing the first jet that they used, the Germans used to try to take out the bridge. This is the 39th coming in. They came in late on the 8th and into the 9th. This is a classic photo at Remagen, them hugging the walls, keeping their spacing, headed toward the bridge to cross. The bottom picture is the tunnel on the inside, looking out. And the next picture is a rare picture of the inside of the tunnel that I was able to find. Now, I found a written note by my dad, again, after he died. He says in the note that he went through the railroad tunnel, exited on the other side, and went up in the forest toward Orsburg. Orsburg is up here. The tunnel is right here, the bridge into the tunnel, and it comes out in this railroad. And then he went through, there's the railroad right there. He came out here and they marched up this road to Orsburg. And when they got there, again, it was this hurry up and wait. These guys were cold, they were hungry, had been up all night traveling and whatever. So what do? They commandeer a farmhouse. When we were there in '95 with him, we sat at the river. They have a nice promenade. Remagen has a nice promenade in here. We got a pizza, and he starts talking about all this stuff. And he was telling us how they commandeered this farmhouse. Guys were chasing chickens. They chased the women and children out of the house and fried up their potatoes. And they were waiting for the rest of them to catch up. And so initially the German defense was relatively weak until that afternoon, and they went up to the next village, Bruckhausen, which is up in here. I have another slide. And that's kind of when it all happened. The defense was quite strong. They had 2 counterattacks that day. But in going back years later, looking at this, I found the farmhouse. It's at the top of the hill, that long road that goes up. It's at the top of the hill. And I had a German friend with me, and we met the lady on the inside, and this is the kitchen. And she let us into the kitchen, and it was pretty amazing. That we were able to do that. And they thought they knew the owner of the house. But again, after going through all this, I guess it had sold hands. But I thought maybe we were going to find the original owner of the house during the war. That didn't happen. Here's the entry. The kitchen's back here. There's a whole farmyard back in here. This building has been rebuilt. It's half torn down. They rebuilt it. So it saw a lot of action there. Like I said, they moved on to Bruckhausen, and then this is roughly the route they took up this gnarly terrain. There's peaks in here. There's gravel pits that are taking material out of. So it's a pretty gnarly piece of land. The road net is not very developed. And it took them 4.5 days to get from Bruckhausen up to this area here. And this is a real big bowl, and they were located here. There was a sawmill and an intersection up in here, and my dad was wounded right here. And I found some documentation from a friend of mine. It was a report that wasn't an official report, but I think it was from the command structure that was sent. The report was sent up, and it talks about P-47s coming in, dropping short. And they said no one was wounded. Well, that's not correct, because 2 men were wounded that I know of, one at the sawmill in G Company and my dad here in E Company. And when my dad died, this man here sent my mother a letter and said, well, that's the same day I was wounded. We were probably in the same aid station. And it was obviously down valley a little bit. And then they took him down to Kasbach down here, which there was another aid station at. And so he was evacuated back to an evacuation hospital back toward Aachen. So this is a Google picture of where we're at, and that's the exact spot where I'll show you pictures in a second that I believe he was wounded. The coordinates are kind of over here in this valley, and again, this sawmill that we were talking about is up the road a little bit. And Kasbach is down here. We went with our German friend, had lunch there, and he says, I want you to know, he took us there on purpose, I want you to know this was the aid station where they probably treated your dad. It's now a restaurant. And then he was trucked and probably went across a pontoon bridge to get back about 100 kilometers up to the evacuation hospital. The goal on everybody was trying to get to Vettelschloss. And there was this main highway through here. They were at the edge of it, and by the time, after he was wounded the next day or so, they had a rest here at Vettelschloss for about a week. And he came back from the hospital and in time to meet them at Vettelschloss the day before they took off again. So this is looking in the tree area near where I'll show you some craters. This is Notscheid back here, another village. Vettelschloss is over in here. These are the beginning of some craters we found. In 2010, we dedicated a plaque, and we went over, we had the coordinates, and I had this German friend, and he said, let's go find this stuff. And so we went over there, and boy, we walked right into these craters. Look at the size of those trees that are growing out of the craters. And there's another one, it was snow in the spring when I was there, and then it went back in the summer. But again, these are significant holes in the landscape. And it's at the edge of the woodland, and this is a plowed field out in here, so no one's ever gone through to reclaim it. And as we were walking there on our last visit, my wife here, we were walking out of the leaves in October, and the leaves, those oak trees and deciduous trees, the leaves are quite thick. And she's walking up the hill, and she kicks up this M1 shell. And I'm going, are you kidding me? And we had found shrapnel and stuff too, but that was a live shell. We took it back, of course, and I took the, it's right here. I took the lead out of it and dumped the powder on a rock, and we lit it that night. It's still burned after all those years. So that thing actually still has a live charge for the initial, what do you call it? The firing, cap. That's still live. So who knows? I mean, it could be. It's there where he was wounded, because I'm pretty well convinced I know where the spot is, and that could have been cleared out of his gun. Who knows? A guy could have dropped it too, but. And this piece of shrapnel that we found, several locations, and I brought some of that home and here. One of them you can see the screws. This is the nose cone, and this is where the screws for the detonator is. So these are the records that I found. This is quite a story. I kept writing to, in my quest for information, I kept writing to the archives. And I kept being told, we had a fire, there's no records. And I did that 2 or 3 times, and I'm thinking,
It didn't burn the bees, though.
it didn't burn everything up. And so I wrote a letter back. I don't know what gave me this idea.
HF and Gs.
So is that it? I wrote a letter back, and I said, under the Freedom of Information Act, I want all the records for this man and his serial number. So about a month or 2 months later, I get something, they said, well, send us X amount of bucks, $30 or something, I don't know what it was. And they sent me the whole file. So these are, I believe, this one with the hole is the original that was written up by the medic. And it talks about a brain injury, concussion from aerial bomb, and the purple, eligible for Purple Heart, but it wasn't given. Here's the backside of the same thing. It's a little hard to read, and as you look, there is some damage on these. This side is the hospital record that was typed up after the fact, with the same information basically, but it's typed. And again, concussion, a cerebral, whatever the S is, so anyway, I found this, and then at the bottom, there's a gentleman down in Colorado Springs who was the 1st Battalion surgeon, Dr. Craig Larmer. And he's since passed away, but he had written a letter to the Octafoil, the newsletter. And I'm going, aha, look at this. There's a battalion surgeon in Colorado Springs. I called him up. I went down and saw him. He was a lovely man. He was an anesthesiologist in Colorado Springs, retired, of course. And he went through these records with me and helped me understand what was written from a medical point of view. He was terrific. Oh, I was going to tell you about, and so he tells me, he's looking at this, and this Briggs, J.M. Briggs at the bottom, who is his counterpart in the 2nd Battalion. And he goes, there's Jake the Snake. His first name's Jake. He went to medical school with him at Northwestern University. He was from Slida, and his father was a doctor. No, not Briggs, but Larmer. And he went to the same medical school as his dad, and this is where Briggs was, and they were classmates. And there was something funny that happened where this nickname came out, Jake the Snake. And so he didn't know where Briggs was, and he discovered it on that. These are some other records that I was able to get. So, like I said, he was trucked across probably a pontoon bridge. I've got 2 sketches here. This is an interesting story, and over here you may want to look through. There was a unit, the 1120 Engineering Combat Group, and I don't know what division they were with. I haven't looked them up, but this guy named Rudy Wedow, W-E-D-O-W. And he was this terrific artist. So he was a combat artist that had developed all these sketches. And I must have 50 of them over there. And they were at Remagen. It's the only sketches I could come up with from him at Remagen. But there's a ton of other places through France that are quite interesting to look at. Rudy died in 1965, I think, born 13. Yes?
You said your dad was trucked across on the pontoon bridge.
I believe so.
He originally crossed on the Ludendorff.
Oh yeah, he crossed.
Then he was wounded.
And they brought him back.
And when he came back, he came out.
They shut all the traffic off on the Ludendorff Bridge. It was Yeah, well, that was the 17th, 10 days later. But that was a one-way bridge over. Any of the wounding and whatever came back, and probably some of the supplies were taken over on these secondary bridges. They were actually primary bridges in the end. But there were 3 or 4 of them that combat teams put up.
Yeah, there probably was the 291st and the 51st.
Probably. I've researched some of that, but I hadn't put it into this presentation because it's a level of detail that I didn't want to get into, bore you guys with that. But yes, there were several companies, and there was a gentleman in Denver that I saw an obituary for probably 5 years ago in the paper who was here and built those bridges. He had just recently died. Like we said, the bridge collapsed, Ludendorff Bridge. It was a railroad bridge. It collapsed on the 17th, probably because of the overuse, heavy materials, tanks and stuff trying to get across. In the initial capture of the bridge, the Germans blew a hole on the west side that had to get filled, and they couldn't get all this stuff over early on. And then they tried to repair the deck and a lot of things, and structurally, because of these explosions and whatever that, the big ordnance stuff coming in, it eventually gave out, and it killed 28. I read somewhere there were 200 engineers on the bridge and 28 were killed. We've talked about this. He had a brain injury and bruising, and he was eventually on the 21st in the hospital given his Purple Heart. Obviously he had a combat infantry badge. He had 2 Bronze Stars, a Good Conduct Medal, and the octafoil and the 47th symbol. And they started from Wettelsschloss on foot, and then later trucks started toward Berlin. So they were down here. Here's Bonn, and Remagen is right here. And so the First Army's swinging through here. The 9th and I think the 3rd Armored Division that was up north, and they tried to capture, and they did capture, like 300 to 350,000 Germans in this area. It's called the Ruhr Pocket now, but originally I've read that it's called the Rose Pocket, and I'll talk about that in a second. Here's Oberkirchen, where they were trying to get to. They were over here at Marburg, and trucked again, taken out of the direction they were headed and sent another way to close off Oberkirchen. So this area.
Could you go back just a second?
Yes. Back it up? Sure.
So you said Remagen was below Bonn there.
Yeah, it is. It's just not on this image.
So,
It's right here.
If the 9th crossed at Remagen, what did they do? March north along the river to get up there?
No. They cut cross country this way. They were over here at Marburg. And then they turned them and went this way.
That's the 9th Army, not the 9th.
That's the 9th Army, exactly. Yeah, they were part of the 1st and Hodges. Yeah. It's a little confusing, I agree. So this was General Rose, which you talked about last weekend. He was from Denver. I thought his dad was a surgeon at Rose Hospital, but I don't think that's true anymore. Do you know, Mike?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, I think there's an exhibit down there at Rose Hospital. Actually, Eisenhower came and dedicated it, I believe, obviously after the war. But he was the highest ranking officer, and he was Jewish. So it was initially called the Rose Pocket, and later they named it the Rose Hospital, and both our kids were born there. There's a lot of information on him down at the hospital if you want to go down there. I've stopped there once to look at that. So I'm going to digress here a little bit and tell you about a research effort that we got in to the second battle, which was Oberkirchen. And so this was a joint effort between Michael Kuthen. He's quite a lovely guy. He's really interesting. He's the local forester. So he's out in the woods all the time around Oberkirchen. And they have buffalo problems, bison problems that are damaging and the forests there are privately owned. So he's managing that for the state, and the state is reimbursing these guys from the horn damage that the buffalo do on the trees. So he's dealing with everybody. He knows everybody and knows the whole area. He's sort of a local historian and has been involved in a lot of projects in the city, a small village, from a history point of view. And of course myself, and so he did the German side, I did the American side as far as research goes. We started in 2010 when we were introduced. When I was there in 2010, they told me about this guy, and they got us together, and then for 3 or 4 years we worked together. We were back and forth. He came here, we've been there. He's been here twice, we've been there 3 or 4 times. And we published a book. This is Michael right here, my wife, and me. And we had an interesting story. He had this lady come in, a newspaper reporter, like somebody from the Broomfield Enterprise, right? It was a local newspaper. And he thought this was newsworthy and wanted her to come over and talk about our joint effort and take a picture and whatever. So she was very polite, and she came over. She spoke some English, and Michael speaks pretty good English. My German's not so good, nicht so gut. And she's being very polite about everything and taking pictures and asking questions. And then all of a sudden she asked me, "How old was your father when he was here?" And I said, 19. And the whole demeanor of her changed. She had a 19-year-old. And all of a sudden, she got real interested in this. I couldn't believe it. But she was very helpful at the end, equating, I guess, her son to my father and my father's experiences and her son, and thinking, I suppose, that, well, this could have been him, kind of a thing. So that was kind of an interesting experience we had. This is some of the source of the data. I'm going to go through this real quick. You can read all this, but the military records, 8 Stars to Victory, which I brought, which is the history of the 9th Infantry that they published after the war. It's kind of the Bible, but there's some inaccuracies with it, obviously. I was able to find another book on the War Pocket that I think it might have been German translated. Then we had some non-recorded memories, which is kind of interesting. Again, because of the German connection, we met Alphonse, and he was in his 80s. He was a 17-year-old, and I'm going to talk about in a second, at one of the battle sites, and remembered everything. It was incredible. We met keep hitting the wrong button. We met Walter. He's the son of the mayor. His dad was the mayor during the battle, and he had great memories. And the most interesting guy we met was Herman. And we got to know Herman very well. His grandfather was shot, taken away to try to save him, I guess. And I think my dad's squad or company, he was shot with a pistol, not a rifle. And we think he owned the properties on both sides, I'm going to show you, but he had part of a German uniform on. So he was probably part of the German local group. And he just was in the wrong place at the wrong time with a piece of uniform, and he was shot. And he was probably trying to protect his property. But Herman was a nice guy. And he told my wife when we were there, just out of the blue, he basically said, "I am glad you guys won the war." And we're going, "What? You know, why would you say that?" You know, he's gone, "Because we'd be speaking Russian." And he was quite serious about that. And there's no animosity in Oberkirchen over this heavy fighting that happened at all. We did not encounter that very often.
We did the first time because we stayed.
Yeah, we
in that
stayed here.
hotel,
Yeah.
And the son, who was this Herman's father, had to take over the hotel when he was age 13.
Yeah, and he was
His father
negative.
was killed. And
Yeah.
so when we first stayed there and they found out that Terry's father was one of the American soldiers there, they did not say another word to us.
Yeah, they just treated
They
us
just
very
clamped up,
politely
they
and,
treated us terrible.
yeah.
And this is that man's son who's very friendly
Yeah.
to us.
So the most valuable thing I think I could tell you of this joint effort with Michael is we've come up with these diaries and books that has happened. He found the German interview that was published. We talked about Jack Bland, and again, a German book. Mercedes is, that's not, I forget how you pronounce that, is the county, and somebody has written a book about all the battles around the county. But we've come up with these private diaries. And I don't know very many researchers that get into this level of detail. But we were lucky in coming up with these. Gisela Hohen was this precocious 16-year-old that wrote all these, for months she wrote all these notes and daily logs about the village. They were relocated. They didn't grow up there, but they were sheltering there with friends. And the Germans would come through, stay at the house, and all these things. She'd ride a bicycle to the far village to get meat. All this stuff. And then, as the battle happens, she starts reporting on that and meeting the American soldiers. There was a law in the artillery, and they came out, and she's talking to the soldiers and reporting where the soldiers are. It's a wealth of information that we found. There's others that were evacuated German citizens, local residents. Vorwald is a next little village that we found. Michael came up with the majority of these that we've translated, but there's various sources of what happened in that brief period of time in this village. So as a result of that, we published a book. Actually, Michael published it. It's in German. I've since had it translated. I think he sold these. I had several copies. I've got a copy here. It's in German. The English I had translated, it needs to be rewritten. It's so hard to understand. If you've seen translated German and then to English, it doesn't translate exactly right, you know. And so I need to go through and rewrite this to make it valuable for English readers. But basically, let's see, this is talking about the link up of, let's see here. The 30th, yeah, they got transferred, loaded on trucks toward Oberkirchen. I'll show you a map next where they were. And then it was one of the key escape routes in the Ruhr Pocket. That's the value of it. So this is a battle map based upon the reports. And they were trucked from Marlborough up to this area where they bivouacked on a ridge. And the main road comes down, and so F Company joined a company of tanks and tank destroyers. And they started down this road, and the foot soldiers went this way, they split it, and the 2nd and the 4th were held in reserve on top of Lingenscheid, this hill. The 1st and the 3rd, which was my father, that came down this way, and they may have come this way too, down into the village. It was wet and cold. They got off an hour late. Instead of at 8 o'clock, they got off at 9 o'clock. They were heating cans of K rations and water and coffee to try to warm these guys up to get them started. So they didn't start off in the best conditions. Some important things here. There's a slate mine that a lot of the residents in the village would escape to. It's a big slate area, everything's slate, roofs, siding. There's a village here called Vorwald, which G Company took, and I believe that was the battalion headquarters. And then there's an area we're going to talk about in a second, Markshagen, where the older gentleman, Alphonse, was staying. I'll talk about that. And the Germans were coming from Winkhausen this way. And there's a Panzerlehr 130, basically tanks with assault troops. And they got into the village. Here's a better plan of the village. And quite frankly, the action is this around this stretch of road. There's a way coming in, another way coming in, a way leaving, another way leaving, and obviously other places. But this intersection right here is the main goal of the 9th, 2nd Battalion, is to hold that village and keep the Germans from escaping. This is an old map, but it shows some of the key locations. This is Vogt's property, and he owned this over here. I'm going to talk about that. The church, it's a 800 or 900-year-old church that's there. The village is that old. So it's in here. The school is here. These were key families where a lot of these people were staying here. This is a thing called a shooting hall, and if you've not been to Germany, the firearms in Germany pretty much are banned. You really can't have firearms, the major topic here. But they have these shooting clubs, and they do hunt. And these shooting clubs are in every little village. And it's called a shooting fest. And while we were there one time, we actually went. They have the king and queen and this parade. I mean, it's a big deal. It's a big social event. So in Oberkirchen, the shooting hall is right here. So this is a picture from 1940 of the village that I found. And again, this stretch of road through here is important. And then there's a stream that comes in and out, the Lenne River, which is a tributary of the Ruhr River. So this pretty much it's a major intersection, and it's basically urban warfare. That's what this was. This phase of the battle at Oberkirchen was really urban warfare. This is a picture, the only picture I found from Oberkirchen that the U.S. troops took, the photo service. And this is what, an M4, I think? It's an-
That's the EZ8.
Is that it? I don't know what that is.
See the suspension on there?
Okay,
That was the one that they came out with late that rode real nice.
okay, well, you can see the logs here that they've added to the tank to take the initial, a Panzerfaust or something, shooting at it, that blow the logs up first before it got to the tank, right? There's a dead German laying here. This obviously is after the battle. This is a photo. My friend here owns this restaurant, Drost, George Drost. He gave me this. This is a 500-pound bomb they found in the street, 61. And they dug this thing out. So.
Terry, how much longer do you have?
No, I don't know. I can talk a little bit longer. Too long?
Yeah, keep going.
You want me to keep going? I can shorten it if you want.
Well, keep going.
Okay. So those were the first part. I was going to read some of this, or at least tell you some detail of the battle. So on the 3rd of April at 0900, they started into the village. The mailman's father told me that I met in 2010 that there was, the village changed hands 7 times. And I'm thinking, wow, okay. But as I go through this, you make your judgment too. I mean, I can't exactly count them, but it was back and forth a lot. It was blasted previously by artillery fire. F Company we talked about joining the tanks. G Company stayed at Vorwald. E Company split. 2 and 4 platoons were in reserve, and the 1st and 3rd went in to the village. And a Panzerfaust, which is a captured German bazooka, basically, a one-time use bazooka, was carried into battle. My dad said he carried one in, and it was an important weapon to the U.S. troops. There's actually radio transmissions asking for more Panzerfaust. So they must have had a source of them that they had captured. E Company requested air support at 15:10. At 8:45 that evening, they basically had, the town was successfully cleared. But however, Captain Petty of E Company organized the company to anticipate more counterattacks. My father remembers, and where this fits into the battle, I'm not quite sure, but this is Vogt's barn, and this is his hotel here. My dad remembers going into a barn on a cobblestone street, hiding behind the door, and then hearing the German soldiers coming down with the hobnail boots on the cobblestone. And I asked him before he died, I said, well, what did you do? And he goes, I got out of the way and let somebody with a bigger gun than my pea shooter, the M1, first. So I don't know what happened on the whole thing, but that's what he remembers. Then later, this is Volt's house. This is it after the battle. If you'll notice the arches, you'll see that later. Here's the arches again, you can see. I believe that's the barn down here. And this is Franz Volt, who was killed probably by my father's unit. There was a heavy counterattack at 10:55 on the 3rd. 200 troops, 5 tanks came in. They got within 50 yards of E Company. The record says Captain Petty disabled a German tank. E Company lost 2 tanks and 2 tank destroyers and requested replacement. There weren't any extras. So the 1st Battalion of the 47th sent some replacements down for them. And then the radio log, it says, hey, we wanted rabbits and turtles back. So they wanted that equipment back after this battle was over. Then during the night, E Company platoons were overrun and isolated. Some men made it back up to Lingenshield, the hill where the 2nd and 4th platoons were. And here's a picture of one of the tanks. I found these up in Seattle, near Seattle. I tracked down Jay Garner's daughter, who was my platoon leader for my dad. And she remembered several stories that he told her. And I got into her husband. She was lukewarm on helping me. She was a librarian, that's how I found her. But her husband said, yeah, we got a Foot Locker. And so he got into that Foot Locker, and we came up with a whole bunch of photos that I'll show you shortly. So this is one, and again, back here at Volt's place, this is his house that was destroyed. The church is back in here, and you can still see smoke coming up. Again, this was an American tank that was destroyed. And someone told me here that it was a 75 millimeter. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the long barrel.
Yeah, it's a long barrel one.
Later, Sherman's had the long barrel,
Yeah.
75.
Okay, I didn't know that. So there's a story about Laverne, or Lloyd Holder, there, and I'm going to read something. I don't like to necessarily read it, but it's kind of interesting. And it gives you the flavor of what was happening. So this is that night between the 3rd and the 4th. And it says, during the fierce enemy attack, Holder's squad was subject to heavy counterattack. The enemy infantry reached a point of only 20 yards away. Private Holder, who was acting as squad leader, ordered his squad to withdraw to a more strategic position. With complete disregard for his personal safety, he remained in his hazardous position, delivered a heavy volume of fire at the onrushing enemy, killing 5, wounding at least 10, enabling his squad to successfully relocate. Private Holder left his position and entered a nearby house. Again, I told you this was an urban warfare situation. Leaving the house by sliding down the drain pipe, and these houses are in hillsides there. He encountered approximately 40 of the enemy force, but escaped by feigning dead and rejoining his squad. And my dad told me that this was his friend and probably his squad leader. So I'm kind of thinking this is a good indication of what my dad went through, probably in this squad. At some point, Colonel Magnus ordered troops into the cellars, and they shelled themselves. And the situation by 23:30 was restored, but they were expecting more counterattacks. On the 4th at 2:15, lone German tank entered and fired on E and F companies. Lieutenant or Private Holder ironically survived everything in Oberkirchen, and he was the last man shot, killed on the 18th of April of E Company. His luck ran out, basically, I guess. And so at Markshagen is the next thing I was going to talk about. I'm almost done. And this is Alphonse, the man I told you that's still living. He lived upstairs with about 20 people, he said. And the radio operator came in and set up in the kitchen. This is Alphonse. Set up in the kitchen. He was 17 years old, and I have to assume, because this was a remote village, that he had escaped the network of bringing all those German kids in to the army some way. He was protected, I'm sure. And this is Mark Hagen today. And the story is both in the German side and the English side, American side, that one or two Germans came in. They had a Panzerfaust. They stole the Jeep. They wanted their Jeep because that was the supply Jeep for the company. And they fired into this building, and there was a guard outside, and he walked in. It's probably cold. He walked in, and that's when all that happened. And they stole the Jeep and took it, and it's all in the radio logs about this Jeep, escapade of this Jeep trying to leave. They never caught him. And then later that day, at 0600 in the morning, there was another counterattack, more 200 troops, 5 tanks, and there was a 9-hour battle that went through the village. And eventually at 1600 hours, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the village was finally secured. This is Walter McLinley, and he was the radio operator that was killed in that explosion. His brother joined the 9th Infantry Division Association, and that's how we know about him. This is the Lenny River, and my dad tells a story of chasing a sniper, and this, I don't know when this happened in the stage of the battle, but I'm assuming it's at the end. And before or after the war, in the 60s, I think the same time they found that bomb, they had channelized the Lenny before it was open banks, and the people were walking down to the river on steps and stuff. And my dad was in a door frame, he said, and Lieutenant Garner had a mirror looking out, and there was a sniper, and they were trying to get the sniper. And he was sending men out. My dad went out, and it hit. My dad was short. He probably aimed higher, and it hit the door frame above his head. And then he ran across the stream and up the riverbank. He never said what happened to the sniper, but I'm assuming they got him. So this is again another picture of a tank at you can see the Volts building. April and May, they continued on toward Berlin. They fought in the Hertz Mountains. We talked about Nordhausen and the concentration camp, and the V-2 rocket elements of the 9th found that.
Shouldn't they continue east toward Berlin?
Oh yeah, you're right. Good catch. Mistakes happen.
Yeah, there's another slide, the same thing.
I had the wrong direction.
I would have gone west.
Anyway, they met the Russians. I did find this photo in the Foot Locker that was taken about the 8th or 9th of May, and my dad's in red. I think this is Garner, and this is Captain Petty. And then again in that same Foot Locker, we found these photos. So this is Manus and Captain Petty here, and the other key officers of the battalion. The 9th Infantry received 2 Presidential Unit citations for the Remagen Bridgehead, and that was after the war, I believe. It wasn't right away. And one for Oberkirchen, the 2nd Battalion, 47. And those were within 3 weeks of those battles. Manus and Petty both received Distinguished Service Cross. These guys were active participants. I mean, they were the leaders, but they didn't mess around. They took out tanks and they were recognized. It's incredible how these guys acted and operated. And then Private Holder received one posthumously. These are some slides. I believe these are my dad's squad or guys within the platoon. Some of them are pretty rough characters. I think this is my dad right here. It's a little hard to recognize him. But some of these guys are kind of rough looking, particularly this guy back here. And they were relocated to Ingolstadt, which is down by Munich. And here's my dad cutting hair of somebody. And the tent, pup tents, they were living in pup tents. They were really pissed at this because they were living out in the woods. This is basically after the war was over and the Germans were still in their houses. They wanted to be in the German houses. He was really upset that they still had to be outside. And he was in occupation there. He was moved to Cannon Company, which originally started out, if you remember, he learned artillery. He got a cushy job driving a Jeep for the Cannon Company commander. I know he took a trip to Nuremberg, taking some witnesses up there and doing some other things. And then they moved near Fusen, and you probably recognize the Disney Castle, Neuschwanstein. And we visited there with our kids, and do you think he ever told us that he was there? He stayed in this hotel. Never told us. And then the last story is about, he had a dog. It's hard to read, but here's his dog. And his dog was named Beat Up. And he was trying to bring him home. He never did, but I don't know the whole story on that. But when we were kids, we ended up getting a Dachshund. Bon von Hohenstaufen was her name. She was registered, and they wanted to raise these Dachshunds, and I think that's a result of his experience in Germany. I became a member of the 9th Infantry Division Association. Again, like I said, it was started in '45. We dedicated a plaque at the Remagen Bridgehead in 2010. And the people in Remagen, the former mayor, the current mayor, the village gave us a party. I couldn't believe it, with food, and we had speakers, and a couple of the speakers was the son of Strobel, who was killed by the Germans because he lost the bridge. His son spoke. We had some other people speak as we dedicated this plaque, and this is from what we called the sons and daughters of the 9th Infantry, as us offspring kept this organization going. We did this plaque because the old guys didn't want to do it. And we're going, well, what the hell? This was a significant event that these guys did, and everybody else is up on the stand. So my associate, William Sowers, and myself, I designed a plaque, and we had it made, and we're dedicating it. And so, last two things. Last year, we had the 76th reunion, and we went back to Fort Bragg. That's where they trained. This is the 4th visit that we made as an association. And Fort Bragg went all out for us. I couldn't believe it. Unfortunately, I missed it because I'd been in the hospital sick. Our son made it, and his wife, representing us. But this is, we have a monument there, back here, and we dedicated another plaque, and we had a couple veterans. This guy's 101 or 2. This guy's 97. He's still alive. There were several Vietnam veterans there. And our guest speaker was on the front page of the Denver Post a year ago in August. When the troops came home from Afghanistan, he was the last soldier out of Afghanistan. He was the commander of the 82nd Airborne there. And he insisted that he would be our speaker. And I guess he was fantastic. Really a nice guy. And this past June, we were in Texas. We went to the Woodlands. This is our 77th reunion. And I got Jim, my wife is here. Where's Jim?
I'm to the left there.
I don't see him. Oh, there he is.
Bald guy.
There's
Jim's sitting right here.
right here. His wife Bonnie was there.
Yeah. So we went to this place, and I don't know the whole story. I'm not going to get into it, but this guy has duplicated the west wing of the White House. You think I'm kidding? I'm not.
Exact replica.
The exact replica of the west wing of the White House in his garage. And this garage was not a garage, but it was an edifice. This huge thing. I mean, he's got the Oval Office, the same carpet. I should have put a picture in. Same carpet, the same mural in the ceiling that's cast in, the same pictures on the walls, a picture of Trump on the desk. I mean, he had the First Lady's area. It was incredible. And this guy, that's where we had our reunion, was there. And so I just couldn't believe it, but that's where we were. And this lady right here is a travel agent, and that was her client. So, anyway, Mike, I'm finally done. I'm sorry I took too long. This is too much?
Well, a little longer than our normal time. But anyway, thank you
Okay.
so much.
Oh,
I'd
thank
like to
you.
give you one of our chairs.
Yeah, sure. Fantastic.
And I'd encourage you, please come up. There's a lot of fascinating items up here. And visit the rest of the museum as well. So, thank you.
Good.